And that draws us quite nicely into this sort of opening session where Beverley from Development Gateway is going to talk about their work on databases within the agricultural sector and give some ideas about how these things can actually work in practice. So, Beverley, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let you take over from here. And it'd be great to hear from your Development Gateway's experience in this area.
Super. Thanks so much, Mark. Let me just share my screen. Hi, everybody. It's a privilege to be here with a bunch of agriculture nerds, as I like to say. I'm Beverley. I'm the Director of Policy at Development Gateway and IREX Venture. And we work in partnership with governments in over 40 countries across Africa, Central America, and parts of Southeast Asia, looking at how do we get the right data in the right hands at the right time. So we both build databases, dashboards, and tools, and we advise on data governance, data management, and data policy to facilitate better data sharing. So today, I'm going to focus on really one simple idea. How can we move from building programs or working on individual companies to building systems? Most importantly, what's stopping us and what could we do? What could we make possible if we moved and shifted into this mindset? Too often, our programs deliver excellent tools, targeted data products, meaningful outcomes for businesses and clients. But often, too many of these successes live in silos. A dashboard here, a survey data set there, a mobile tool that stops working after funding dries up because there isn't an independent funding source. These pieces matter, don't get me wrong, but they don't add up to systems. If we want to really enable functioning markets, strong local enterprises, and effective government partners, we have to shift from a project mindset to a systems building mindset. Systems building really means ultimately interoperability, to draw a key theme from the data and the technology space, not just of technologies, but of incentives, relationships, and in particular, data flows. It means asking, how does this work contribute to a wider ecosystem that outlives our individual or collective involvement? So we've basically solved world peace, right? We've achieved world peace at this point. So what's the problem? You're probably asking. Nothing I've said in the last slide is new. I think a major challenge that we fear is each other. Let's name it. Many implementers and even private sector actors are hesitant to share data with each other and especially with government because we fear what it might reveal. It shows gaps, failures, potentially a loss of competitive advantage and exposure to criticism. But here's the truth, failure isn't the risk, silence is. When data stays locked in drawers or dashboards, we all lose the opportunity to learn, to course correct, and to collaborate more effectively. So now we have to ask, in my view, slightly different questions. Who can enable safe and productive data sharing? And who holds the data and who ensures it's used for collective benefit? These aren't just technical questions, they're governance questions. They're about power, trust, and the kind of ecosystem we all ideally want to build. So let me share an example from work that Development Gateway has done in partnership with IFDC, the International Fertilizer Development Center in Nigeria. This is a stock photo, but I think it's very accurate as a descriptor of the kinds of skepticism we met when we first started engaging with the private sector fertilizer community in Nigeria. In Nigeria's case, the sector is very driven by the private sector with a little bit less government involvement, not none, but it's very much driven by a couple of key and very large companies. There was already an existing structure in place. IFDC, our key partner on that work, had been running a fertilizer technical working group to sense-make key data on a couple of core indicators annually or biannually for a number of years. Where we found an issue and what we had been brought in with Gates funding to help strengthen and grow was that data wasn't quite giving the picture that everybody needed, not the government, not the CSOs, and certainly not the private companies who were engaged. They would show up to the meeting all right, but to get follow-up afterwards, to get data around, for example, more import or export data, to get that data on time was lacking. They didn't fully buy in to that process of sense making. What we learned from listening and developing a series of co-design sessions was that although IFDC served as a neutral collection point for the data, there was a lot of cross-pollination between the private sector and IFDC. Former people who had formerly been at individual companies were now working at IFDC, and there was a very real concern that these people, even though they were working for a new employer, might have allegiances to their former employer and share some of the data that they were receiving in confidence with companies' competitors. How we addressed that was to continue demonstrating the value of sharing the data by visualizing in more compelling ways some of the data that was already being shared, and then developing a template non-disclosure agreement with attached data protection protocols. I helped draft that on behalf of IFDC to do that with each of the key companies who were sharing data, where we put explicitly in writing in black and white and said, this data is being used for this purpose. It will not be shared with your competitors. When it is shared and stored, this is how it's shared and stored with IFDC. We explained in the document, this is how that data is anonymized and aggregated with other companies' data. And then these are some of the things, i.e. the visualizations on the dashboard that you can expect to benefit from. These are some of the things that we use that data to do. When we had more consistent data coming in on which crops were consuming the most data, where blending plants existed, how the distribution of cropland under production, we could then show rather than tell to the key partners across that working group space. These are the kinds of things you could benefit from. I won't say it's kumbaya, but at the end of that program, after 7 years of engagement, I'm not saying it's going to take you 7 years to do that. I think we were already seeing benefits, already seeing a shift, an ecosystem shift before that. Private sector had started, as I showed you, a little bit of skepticism around why they needed to share that data consistently. Now that private sector group in Nigeria is highly engaged and has even co-invested $100,000 of their own company funds to maintain the fertilizer working group so that it could continue meeting consistently without the need for development partner funding. They also were part of that same group also funded dedicated research to look at cost chain buildup, which is a very specific value chain tracing methodology that the IFDC couldn't fund on its own, and they were able to fund that work across 36 states. When we ran around after we had set up these dashboards and put these NDAs in place and then asked those companies to contribute to maintaining that structure, we heard repeatedly from partners, this is the first time we've ever given money to something like this. And there weren't massive figures, depending on who you're talking to. It was $10,000 or $20,000 here and there. But that was the difference between a structure that was basically dependent on US government or philanthropic foundational funding and creating a structure that everybody could benefit from. Everybody could see the benefit of sharing that data regularly so that they knew what was happening across Nigeria. In a country with a really dense agricultural space, a lot of actors, there was still room for collaboration. There was still room for targeted investment strategy and identifying key distribution gaps. So many of the countries where you're working and serving are underserved. Ultimately, there's more than enough room in these markets for multiple enterprises to thrive, but not if everyone is operating with just a sliver of data. Sharing data doesn't mean losing competitive advantage. It means creating the conditions for smarter investment, better targeting, and new partnerships. It's not a zero-sum game. It's an abundance model. And abundance thrives on visibility, not isolation. So here's my invitation to you. I think that we can push ourselves and each other to go beyond building programs instead of just building systems. Beyond building programs and start building systems for real. I think if we're brave enough to think about what we can share and how we can share it safely with one another, even within this group, if we're smart enough to think about enabling enough interoperability in our existing programs and work, and if we're strategic enough to share to ensure that what we build is durable and inclusive and locally owned, I think we have a real shot. I think we need to start measuring our success, not just by what we deliver, but by what we unlock. I think if we can get this right, we won't just fill gaps in agricultural productivity and farmer wealth and strength, I think will grow opportunity for all of us. I think we can do that best when we do it together. Happy to take any questions, and of course can share some case studies and things that we've used that speak a little bit more to how we've approached data sharing across different agriculture value chains.
Yeah, thanks.
I would stick to time marks.
No, that's good. That's great. That's really good. And hopefully that's inspired people to understand. I know you're talking about the fertilizer sector, and we're talking about more general sort of BDS sector that covers a range of things, but the message is the same for sure. And I hope people will reflect on what can we do inside the global AMEA network, but maybe inside those local networks that exist at country level, and maybe within certain value chains. There's a way to start this movement from projects to systems, isn't there? And it doesn't have to be the big bang straight away. It can be just movements that push the system in the right direction. And eventually, so like we build up over time to a system. But if we don't move at all, we will constantly come back and talk about the same old problems time and time again, for sure. So thank you, Beverley. Please ask your questions to Beverley in the chat. If Beverley wants to share case studies in the chat as well, links to those, I'm sure it would be really appreciated.